responses from mom and dad, and so forth. Little experimental scientists is how Piaget thought of infants in the sensory motor stage. So, what happens if I kick this mobile, for instance? Or what happens if I smile at the nice lady? Or what happens if I scream right now, right? Think back to attachment theory. Collecting statistics on the responses of the environment to one's own behavior and so forth. Okay. So this is the first stage. Now, Piaget drew tight lines from 0 to 2 for these stages. As I'll mention a little later, this isn't necessarily how we think anymore about this stuff, but it's really important, in other words, to realize that these stages are very useful as long as we accept some fuzziness at the border. So whereas the sensory motor stage, according to Piaget, was between 0 and 2 years, that's not to say that an infant in 1 month after its 2-year birthday is not, out of this stage, according to Piaget. All right. So with that caveat in mind, let's get to the other stages. The pre-operational stage, in some ways, is the most interesting one because it reveals kind of how development progresses. So at the pre-operational stage, from 2 to 7 years old, children can form stable concepts about things. So they know that one ball is similar to another ball, and they call them both ball, and so forth. They can start reasoning, especially once they get a little into this stage. They can start reasoning about things, but it's very flawed, and it's flawed in particular ways. And two ways in which the reasoning of a child in the pre-operational stage is flawed is by egocentrism and by animist thinking. Okay, egocentrism here is going to mean how I feel is how others must feel. Okay, and a child between 2 and 7 years old has real difficulty putting themselves in the shoes of others, especially emotionally. Okay, and this obviously makes social discourse kind of stunted. So 3-year-olds hanging out with each other, can get into fights and so forth because there's disagreements. And I think even more telling about child psychology is this idea of animist thinking. Okay, animist thinking is when you personify or anthropomorphize an inanimate object, understanding mechanical systems as though they were living things, okay, and ascribing to those mechanical systems properties we'd normally ascribe to living things. Now, all humans are guilty of this, okay? The cliche is of the person getting out of their broken down car, kicking it and calling it a piece of junk, and telling the car how much you hate it. Not really helping the situation, is it? So even adults can revert back into this way of thinking. But children between 2 and 7 are quite robust in this way of thinking. And part of this has to do with imaginative play, and it's tough to distinguish those two things, but it's not easy to understand mechanical systems when you personify them. And so infants are limited in that sense. And these can be simple mechanical systems, by the way, simple toys and so forth. So you might ask a child, why does the block fall when I drop it? Right? They're not going to give you the equation for gravity or even just say it's being pulled towards the earth. They're going to say it wants to go to the ground or something like that. Right? And that's maybe not the best example, but I think you can come up with several yourself. Okay. So those are the stages from birth through 7 years. The next two stages are obviously after this. So from 7 to 12, according to Piaget, children are in the so-called concrete operational stage. And this is a stage in which logic, if you will, comes online to a much greater extent. Kids are able to reason at this stage in ways they weren't earlier. So I'm going to give you one example. It's going to be difficult to see on the slide, but you should be following along at home. And this is the so-called conservation task. So in the first picture on this slide, number 1, it said there's 2 cylinders of water, both with equal amounts. It's obvious that they have equal amounts. They're completely level and the same size cylinder and so forth. And the experiment goes like this. If you take B and you pour it into C, you then ask the participant, the child, now which one has more? Kids in the pre-operational stage, when they get to the second part of this task and B has been poured into C, because it's a taller cylinder and the water level is higher, kids in the pre-operational stage will say that C has more water in it. Whereas kids in the concrete operational stage will say they have the same amount still. This is because now they're able to rigorously apply logic, especially in cases where concrete objects are involved. Okay, so this isn't yet the logic that you might have had in high school math, where, you know, A implies B, B implies C, that kind of stuff, using it with symbols and so forth. But when it comes to the logical constraints of nature and real objects, kids in this stage are starting to really get it. Okay, and that's kind of the characteristic psychological advancement made according to Piaget in this stage. Next, we have the formal operational stage. And this is a stage that we all should aspire to, I think. And it's the stage in which we can use logic abstractly. So you can do that kind of logic that I was just describing that you might have encountered in a high school math class. And you can also use hypotheticals. And this is important for moral reasoning especially. So if you're stuck in the concrete operational stage, and I say to you, imagine if you were born in a war-torn country, what would it be like? The concrete operational kid might say, but I wasn't born in that country, and the argument can't get off the ground. But if you say this to an adult who's deep into the formal operational stage of their life, the adult can understand this hypothetical. They don't respond, well, I didn't grow up in a war-torn country. They say, imagine that. If I had grown up there, then this might be the case. So it's that if I had, then this kind of hypothetical that adults start taking, or people over 12 in the formal operational stage begin taking seriously. Now, some additions to this. So those are the 4 stages. We went from sensory motor to pre-operational, to concrete operational, to formal operational. Now, Piaget was explicit in saying that not everyone has to go through all 4 stages, that indeed there are many adults stuck in the concrete operational stage for one reason or another. We might note that going back in time, you might find more people stuck in the concrete operational stage as adults than currently. Attributable mostly to modern education. Most adults get scaffolded by years and years and years of formal education where formal properties of logic and so forth are driven into us. So this highlights, of course, the importance of education, as I note on the slide. We also know now that, and I mentioned this earlier, that these borders are kind of fuzzy. So the idea that you're in one stage and then the next day or very short, you progress instantly into the next one, it's just not the case. That development isn't this kind of, excuse me, I hit the computer. Development isn't this big jump thing. It's more of a continuous thing where you will slowly progress from one stage to the other. So we modern scientists understand that this is an incomplete description, but when you encounter these things in your classes, these old kind of incomplete descriptions, you have to remember that we scientists try and stand on the shoulders of giants. And what I mean by that is we build off old knowledge. The old knowledge isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. So it's important to know the foundations of the field, which is why I think it's important that you know Piaget, because if anyone's foundational to psychology generally and to developmental psychology, it's this guy, okay, and his colleagues. All right. So we're going to move on to another theorist who built off of Piaget and was really trying to understand adolescence. Again, one of these periods that's tough to define. We're just going to call it the time between 12 and 18, okay? Something like that. Your teenage years. All right. Elkind had a few insights about this and did experiments to elucidate these. So what Elkind was interested in knowing was why teenagers are kind of weird. Okay.